Thank you very much for having me here. I'm just going to introduce very briefly the EU Institute for Security Studies is a Paris-based think tank focused primarily on foreign security and defense issues, but we do some energy work. And though our funding comes from the 28 member states, we are not a Brussels institution and cannot speak on behalf of the EU or anything like that. And I will talk about priority issues for cooperation to improve primarily the external aspects of energy security. It may be a bit narrow, but it's what I know. We worked on the international aspects of energy security in our report, which we just completed recently. So one of the things we had a task force which we had representatives from different EU institutions, from DG Trade, DG Energy, having input into the report, but as a background for our think tank produced a separate report at the end. And we launched it about 3 months ago when Crimea was still part of Ukraine, so we were a little bit paranoid that suddenly some of our conclusions might not be appropriate anymore. But one of the things that saved us is our chosen definition of what energy security is and what it means. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But first, talking about a few small priorities from our work. And these were things that we focused on for the EU and Europe to look at for the international aspects of its energy policies, focused on energy security. But as questions about energy mix and many other things related to energy still stay primarily with the nation states, a lot of what we talked about also applies to nation-state decisions and the way that they connect with the world on a bilateral basis, on a regional cooperative basis, or via the EU. One of the things we we recommended prioritizing is looking abroad for coalitions on rules and governance, and that's not just looking to Brussels, but also looking out at the world. For example, on climate policy, there's one of the things we looked at was that climate policy is, to some extent internationally, a key for energy security policy. Getting everybody else in the world to use less energy frees up more supply and helps also with some of our competitiveness challenges. So developing new pipelines and better supplier relations can shift the supply-demand balance in the right direction for us importers, but speeding up the necessary changes in how the world uses energy may fundamentally alter that balance. And this is an important thing for this area of Europe, which has energy-intensive economies. So this is something that for the nation, the capitals around here, to support Brussels policy and efforts on that internationally, but to be very aware and engaged with what's going on those issues. Also, looking at that similar issue about the demand internationally is going to be defined by China's demand, by Asia's demand, and helping to get them on the right track in terms of their market decisions and their environmental decisions can be very important, because the rest of the developing world looks to China as a model. So you can say maybe that increasing the fuel efficiency of Chinese cars, their kilometers per gallon burnt, increasing that a little bit can be more important for the global supply-demand balance of oil than even a brand new oil field somewhere. And in terms of looking a little bit closer to home, the idea of focusing on binding rules for trade and investment. And this is a big thing when we talk about Russia, about how to get everybody to sign on the dotted line and have enforceable, agreeable rules for investment protection in the future. So one of the things that I think is a huge step forward is getting Russia into the WTO just a couple of years ago. And it's something that in the long run I think can be very important. And it ends up being very important also for dealing with a lot of other energy suppliers who aren't even in the WTO. Algeria, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, they're not even in the WTO. So that's what I mean when we're talking about looking at a global aspect on binding rules for trade and investments. Looking closer to home, one of the things we looked at is where speaking primarily about gas supply, where Europe's energy will come from in the future. And people get excited about Africa or East Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, LNG coming from all corners of the world. But to a large extent, with Asia's growing demand and with a booming demand in many actual exporter countries, LNG is going to be useful for Europe. It can be important for, we want to bring it in and have it as a bargaining chip in negotiations with our major suppliers, but the gas is going to be coming from Norway, Algeria, Russia, and a few others as the big suppliers to Europe. Now, when we look at that, then Russia gets a lot of focus. Everybody talks about it, and rightfully so. Engagement on all sorts of issues, huge resources spent on that. But if you look at the other reasonably large suppliers in our neighborhood, specifically Algeria, they get no attention whatsoever. I think the EU has a 5-page memorandum of understanding that we signed with them a couple of years ago, and it's difficult. It's difficult to work with them. It works on both sides. And that also matters actually for this part of Europe as well, because Slovenia gets gas from Algeria via Italy. And when this part of Europe is focused on Russia to the east, you also want to look at alternatives coming from the south. So it matters about the relationships there, not just in a hypothetical sense, but in a real engaging with them in a serious way sort of sense. So moving on from my report a little bit, talking about definitions of energy security. The International Energy Agency calls it energy security is the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at affordable prices. But when we look at the difficult questions being faced today regarding Ukraine and Russia, they're not just about energy and energy security, though those are obviously part of it. Energy security could thus be looked at the security to act in the world without having energy problems unduly influence your decisions. So that's a higher bar for energy security. So right now, European and national energy policies generally use the narrower IEA definition, as did we in our report, so it made it easier to talk about with energy people. But political leaders take a good look at the mix of gas suppliers before they issue statements on Ukraine. And today's energy decisions will affect foreign policy challenges a decade away. The South Stream Consortium, of course, is focused on security of transit, and that's their pitch in terms of, and it's an important item, but it's only one issue related to different components of energy security. So both as a continent and on a national basis, people are focused on diversifying suppliers, diversifying routes, domestic production. It's going through the list. Which of these are realistic areas of cooperation among European states, either via Brussels or with each other? For the diversification and protection of transit routes, what does the process of South Stream over the last couple of years tell you about how well that is a cooperative common area for people in the region? Looking at diversifying primary energy sources, suppliers, production, these things are primarily run at the national level, and it's an area that a lot of work still needs to be done about working on a regional cooperation. That doesn't necessarily mean everything can be done through Brussels, but moving quickly on, there are some inevitabilities about, in my personal opinion, inevitabilities about the future: death, taxes, lots of Russian gas coming to Europe, and continued EU progress on EU competencies. The EU gets a lot of flack for being slow and not quite coming through, but I think the progress that they make and continue to make is impressive and will continue to be impressive where they are allowed to act. So that leads to a future of Russian gas and EU rules, which is something that I think can work for everyone. Thus, as long as member states are hesitant to share energy policy power with Brussels, and in some extent there's a reasonable amount of balance that can be found there, then it makes sense for national capitals to think on a bigger scale, both in cooperation with each other, but also looking out at the world, because the physical interconnections go across Europe, as well as the policy interconnections, often via Brussels, are bringing Eastern Eastern and Western EU states closer together in how they look at the world. Algerian gas matters for Slovenia, Russian gas matters for Portugal. The more we're interconnected, the more we are aware of those different sections, different views at the other end of the Europe, I think the more effective we'll be at engaging with energy security issues. So, one of the things that's very important to do is engaging with wider discussions of rules-based trade. Often energy security discussions get bogged down in the geopolitical and not in the boring stuff. To be present in the WTO, to support the Energy Charter Treaty, to think deeply about the next climate change treaty, and to spend some time focused on the broader definition of energy security rather than just affordable and available. Thank you.